Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a highly debated, intensely scrutinized topic, and we're going to do it by looking strictly at the arguments laid out in the text, The Case for Israel. Now, we aren't here to take sides or push an agenda. Instead, we're going to objectively break down exactly how this author evaluates modern military conduct through the rigorous and, let's be honest, often totally misunderstood lens of international humanitarian law.
Okay, let's dive into this and lay out our roadmap. We'll be exploring 4 key concepts straight from the source: the moral asymmetry argument, the principle of distinction, redefining proportionality, and finally, the threshold of intent.
Section 1. The moral asymmetry argument.
The author builds their entire case on a pretty foundational premise. They argue that to truly understand this conflict, you have to look at it as a profound moral imbalance, rooted entirely in the tactics each side chooses to use. As the text explicitly states, the moral responsibility for civilian casualties is therefore not distributed equally. What the source is asserting here is that a simplistic comparison of casualty numbers, just looking at the math, tells us very little about true moral or legal responsibility on the battlefield.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our second section, the principle of distinction.
In the world of international humanitarian law, the principle of distinction is the absolute baseline. It's the bedrock rule. It mandates that armies must clearly separate combatants from non-combatants, and they have to take feasible precautions to spare civilian lives. So let's look at exactly how the source applies this heavy legal standard to the two actors in this conflict.
The text draws a really stark contrast between their operational methods. On one hand, it describes Hamas as deliberately blurring those lines of distinction by deeply embedding its operations within civilian infrastructure. On the flip side, it contrasts this with Israel's tactics, which the author describes as taking active, calculated measures to issue warnings and desperately try to maintain those legal boundaries.
Digging a bit deeper into that first point, the author asserts that the use of human shields is not just some accidental, tragic feature of this war. According to the text, it is a central, deliberate tactic utilized by Hamas. The source claims that military assets are intentionally hidden in everyday places, neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and vast underground tunnel networks. And why? Well, the author argues this is done for 2 very specific reasons: to complicate Israeli targeting and to maximize the propaganda value when civilians are inevitably harmed. In the author's view, this is the literal weaponization of civilian sympathy.
Conversely, the text details the specific lengths Israel goes to in order to satisfy that principle of distinction we talked about. The source catalogs an extensive list of warnings used before strikes. We're talking direct phone calls, text messages, leaflet drops, rooftop warnings, the creation of temporary humanitarian corridors, and broad evacuation notices. The author makes a really crucial point here. By utilizing all these methods, the defending forces willingly surrender the element of tactical surprise. They are taking on a much greater risk to their own troops in a direct effort to reduce civilian casualties.
Which brings us to Section 3, Redefining Proportionality.
Now, here the source addresses a massive gap between public perception and legal reality. You know the everyday misconception, right? People often assume that proportionality requires equal suffering or some kind of balanced scoreboard of destruction. But the author clarifies that the actual law of armed conflict defines it entirely differently. It's not about equal numbers. It's about weighing the expected civilian harm against the anticipated military advantage.
Let's look at the strict legal question, almost like an evidence board. The law asks, would the expected incidental harm to civilians be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated? Think about it this way. If a major command center is struck, the legal and moral calculus, which the text points out is vastly complicated by the use of human shields, is whether neutralizing that specific target justified the risk, and if proper precautions were taken beforehand. So the crucial point is captured perfectly in this punchy synthesis from the text. Proportionality does not mean symmetry. Equal devastation is simply not the legal standard of international humanitarian law. The author strongly argues that judging the conflict through a lens of symmetrical casualties fundamentally misapplies the law.
Moving into our final part, Section 4, The Threshold of Intent.
This brings us to arguably the heaviest legal concept covered in the text: accusations of genocide. Legally speaking, genocide requires a specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a protected group as such. The text really emphasizes that this legal standard hinges entirely on that specific intent.
It does not hinge simply on mass death or horrific images of devastation, no matter how tragic those realities are.
The source then contrasts this incredibly strict legal threshold for genocide with Israel's actual stated military goals. Following the initial massacres that sparked this current conflict, the text notes that Israel's objective has consistently been to destroy Hamas's military and governing capacity and to rescue hostages. According to the author, fighting a war to dismantle a military organization and its infrastructure represents a vastly different intent than attempted to destroy a protected population group. And this brilliantly illustrates the source's definitive conclusion on how powerful moral words are often misused in public debate. The author argues that while the loss of civilian life is a horrifying tragedy, collapsing all wartime civilian harm into a claim of genocidal intent strips the word of its actual legal meaning. To the author, doing so replaces serious legal definition with pure political rhetoric.
Bringing all these concepts together, the text argues that these three core frameworks are routinely distorted in the public eye. People often ignore the reality of human shields, they expect equal casualties as a measure of fairness, and they point to tragic deaths as definitive proof of genocide. But the legal reality, according to the source, demands the separation of combatants, it weighs military advantage against harm, and it requires a highly specific intent to destroy. Applying this actual legal framework is, the author argues, the only legitimate way to accurately assess moral responsibility in modern warfare.
We've taken a really direct, objective look at the arguments presented in the case for Israel, and it leaves us with a critical, provocative question to ponder as we continue to observe global events. How do the definitions and legal frameworks we use, or maybe even misuse, shape our understanding of modern warfare and moral responsibility? When we're encountering immense geopolitical conflicts, it is absolutely vital to consider the profound weight of our terminology. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking clarity.